Okay, we're live. So again, we talked about moral relativism last time. We looked at the different types of moral relativism, and we looked at some of the arguments in favor of moral relativism. So today, um, we're going to get into what's known as virtue ethics. And I've got it looks like I got a bit of a delay on my computer, right? Typing is just so overwhelming, right? Recording, using Zoom, and typing. I don't know if my computer, my processor can handle it. Um, so we'll talk about virtue ethics today. Sometimes it's referred to as Aristotelian. I mean, is that how you spell it? That doesn't seem right. I guess that is how you spell Aristotelian ethics. No, that's not. Hopefully my spell check will know what I'm trying to say. There we go. That's how you spell it. That's an I instead of E. Okay. Aristotelian ethics, named after Aristotle, the famous Greek philosopher, or Macedonian philosopher, if you want to be uh, geographically specific. Um, and so we're going to get into this today. But before I do, and talk about virtue ethics, which will be the main focus here of the lecture, um, I'd like to get a little bit of brainstorming going, so some class participation would be greatly appreciated here. Um, the title of this class is Contemporary Ethical Issues, and so I'm curious. Usually if you can buy a textbook, a philosophy textbook with this title or something similar, contemporary ethical issues or contemporary problems in morality or contemporary debates in ethical theory. And they usually have a list of topics, and they're almost always the same topics. And so I'm curious, like, I'm assuming most of you have never taken a class in ethics. And maybe you have, maybe you took intro to ethics, but I'm assuming this is your first class in ethics. And I'm assuming that none of you have done this and gone to pick up one of those books that I'm talking about and looked at the table of contents. So I'm curious, like, what sort of idea you might have in your mind. Like, what are some issues do you think that would be covered in a contemporary ethical issues class? I mean, there's some I think that are pretty obvious, and they're even listed, I think, on the syllabus. If you read the description of the class, that's just that I didn't even write. I didn't even write that description. I copied and pasted it from the catalog, but it'll say, this class covers contemporary ethical issues such as this, or that. Anybody have any ideas? Some brainstorming. There's no right answer, I guess. I'm just curious what you guys might be thinking when we think about contemporary ethical issues and problems. Raven just got
I
here.
find that, like, everyday kind of dilemmas that people face, whether it's political or personal, like death penalty or abortion, or
Cool.
maybe like, I don't know, like, would it be wrong to, like, for a poor person to steal something even if it is for their family or things like that?
Those first two are usually in the textbooks that I'm talking about. They're almost always in them, right? There's always a chapter on the death penalty. There's always one on abortion. Um, Usually, I don't see like that one. The last one you mentioned of, like, is it okay to steal if you got to feed your family? That I don't know if that's a contemporary one. That's one. I mean, it is contemporary because I'm sure there's people that are starving today that are willing to steal for their family, and that's still an issue that's contemporary. But I guess it's something that ethicists have been dealing with a long time. Of course, the death penalty is also the same thing. I mean, that's an issue that philosophers have been dealing with for a while. So I guess, to be fair, if philosophy textbooks want to call the death penalty a contemporary ethical issue, maybe I don't know. I don't know how to, like, to frame what you just said. I don't know, stealing for, I mean, poverty stealing. I don't know if there's like a term. Stealing to save your family. Theft is bad, but is it okay if you're desperate? Certainly, there are most philosophy textbooks will tackle the problem of hunger, right, and poverty, right? Those are seen as contemporary ethical issues. I suppose maybe it's fair to call the death penalty a contemporary ethical issue, even though, you know, philosophers have been talking about the death penalty since there's been a death penalty, and that's been a while. But I think you could argue it's maybe it's contemporary because very few developed nations still have a death penalty. Right? I think the United States and Australia are the only two, you know, modern industrialized nations that still do this. Right? If you go to Europe or the UK or Canada, they think it's barbaric. They think it's crazy that we, you know, even in Norway, you know, maybe you're familiar, some of you, with the horrible mass shooting in I forgot what year it was, but it's been a while. I want to say it's been at least 7 or 8 years. There was a mass shooting in Norway by this guy named Andre Breivik, I think was his name. He was this right-wing anti-immigrant kind of extremist, and he went to some camp, this island camp, this getaway summer camp for all these kids, and he shot all these people and killed them. And then he left that island and went to the parliament and shot a bunch of people there. He killed multiple people, and even he doesn't get a death penalty. Even he, I think, according to their law, he can be released from prison in I think like 10 or 15 years from now, right? So you know, I think people still in developed societies, it's a contemporary issue because it's still something that you know, I think modern developed nations debate about. Abortion, you know, that also, I guess, because of modern technology and because of new laws, that has become something that's a contemporary ethical issue. And you mentioned, you know, stealing. Is it okay to steal if you have to feed your family? Again, that's usually not that's usually an old issue, right? That's an age-old philosophical issue. But this notion of hunger and poverty, right? If someone's hungry or is in poverty, is it our responsibility to do that, right? Do we have a responsibility if we're not in poverty, if we're not hungry? Do we have an ethical responsibility to help other people in other cities or other countries or other parts of the world, right? So that's certainly an issue that you're going to see in contemporary ethical issue textbooks. All right, anybody else have any other thoughts or ideas of other issues that might be considered contemporary ethical
Corruption?
issues? What's that?
Corruption?
Corruption. That's another one where I want to say that's an age-old. I mean, it's been around since. I mean, I know for Plato that was one of his main issues in the Republic. You know, how do you organize a society to avoid corruption? You know, I would say though, you know, and maybe I don't want to put words in your mouth, but maybe the reason you're thinking about corruption right now is just because of the state of our politics. And, you know, I don't know if this is really a specifically ethical issue or more of a political issue, but you might talk about, I guess, the influence of money on government, right? Like that's something that is debated. You know, I know the Supreme Court, they just passed. I mean, it was towards the end of the Obama era, so I guess it was at least like 6 or 7 years ago. They passed the Citizens United ruling, which basically made corporations people, and corporations have the same rights of freedom of speech, and so they're allowed to donate however much money they want to political campaigns, and they don't have to divulge it either. And so, you know, I guess that might be something very recent. You know, that's sort of a recent ruling that I guess, you know. So I'll put it up here since you said it. We have to keep in mind, you know, corruption in politics is really an age-old ethical issue, but maybe there are some new developments, you know, regarding it, you know, at least when we specifically look at our government in the United States and that sort of thing. Anybody else got any ideas perhaps for other contemporary ethical issues?
Artificial intelligence?
Good. That's a good one. Yeah, that's definitely going to be something that we're going to talk about. I'm going to try to get to it in this class for sure. Um, that's definitely a very contemporary issue, right? Should we create artificial intelligence? Um, you know, there are many philosophical questions to ask in regards to AI. You know, some philosophers just they attack AI as a philosophical problem. Is it even possible to create artificial intelligence, or are you just approximating intelligence? And those are more technical or abstract questions. But then you have other concerns like, should we even have our AI? Do we want computers running things? Do we want computers? If I program computers to drive cars, how do I tell the computer what to do in a situation like, what if he has to either keep going, what if the computer has to keep going forward and run over 5 people, or it can turn right and hit a wall and kill all the people in the car? So how do I determine, how does an AI robot determine what the best course of action is? And is it even ethical to give a robot or a computer that sort of choice, right? So yeah, good. AI is definitely an issue for this class that we could talk about. Any other sort of technological or any other sort of contemporary issues that come to mind? I've got a lot, but I'm kind of waiting. I don't want to I want to let you guys have a chance to kind of give your input. Let's see. I got something in the chat. Addiction, Unella says. Addiction. Somebody else was going to jump in. Who was talking? If you want to go ahead.
Um, minors being allowed to get married at an early age in some other countries.
Let me just I'll put marriage laws, because that's really broad. You could say we could talk about same-sex marriage. We could talk about arranged marriages. We could talk about, like you said, certain people of certain ages being married in other countries. I guess, like you said, I know in some I think Pakistan and there's a couple Muslim countries where you have these arranged marriages where you got some guy marrying a 14-year-old or 13-year-old. But Unella's put addiction, and then she put parenthood. I'm not quite sure where you're going with the parenthood thing. Maybe this was a pretty controversial. Maybe it's not quite as controversial anymore, but it was pretty controversial in the 70s when adoption agencies first started adopting children to same-sex couples. At first, they didn't let two men. Two men could not adopt, but two women could. A lesbian couple was allowed to. I don't remember what year it was when men were allowed to adopt children, but it was pretty recent, actually. I want to say it was sometime in the 90s. But there's is that right? I guess if you're religious and you have a more traditional view of marriage, that would be an issue. Addiction, she put put addiction, and I would say that maybe that's an issue. I think that's more like a psychological issue or a sociological issue. But I would say something that's related to that would be drug laws. So should drugs be legal? Should drugs be illegal? Should all drugs be legal? Should only some be legal and not others, right? So those are definitely that's definitely something that would be a contemporary ethical issue. Raven wrote gun control. I think that's definitely something that's more contemporary, especially because guns have become more advanced. When the founding fathers wrote the Second Amendment, they had muskets, and now we've got AR-15s and stuff. And so it's become a little bit more complicated, the gun control issue. So yeah, definitely gun control, I would argue. All right, anybody else got any other contenders? All right,
women empowerment?
What's that?
Women empowerment?
The
whole
so feminism, basically?
Yes.
Okay, so yeah. Okay, that would maybe be something like a contemporary ethical issue. We're gonna read the introduction to The Second Sex later in the semester, and that's a feminist text, by Simone de Beauvoir. So we will touch upon those sort of issues. So women's issues, I'll just put feminism as sort of a catch-all, that kind of thing. Anybody else got any other? Let's see. I'm going to do 2 rows here so I can fit more. Okay, 2 columns. Okay. The one you guys missed, or at least there's a few of them. Okay, she got it. Okay, you beat me. I was about to type that one. Raven typed it in the chat box. Animal rights. Good. Okay. Yeah, I put euthanasia, and I think we talked about euthanasia already before. It's and I think Raven actually she explained it. It's like mercy killing, or someone's really sick or they're terminally ill. Is it okay for the doctor to stop treating them and just to let them die peacefully? Some would say that they shouldn't. That's murder, and that's not right. And then, of course, animal rights. There's people who they think that animals have rights just like humans. Some say they have rights, but not quite like humans. There's like middle ground. There's vegans who think that just anything that anytime you kill an animal, it's murder. They have just as much rights as we do, and so that's definitely a contemporary ethical issue. All right. Any other ideas? Immigration, I think, is something that could be considered a contemporary ethical issue. Right? Is immigration good? Is it bad? Is it, are we unethical if we don't allow people to immigrate? Those sort of things. Another thing, I'm just doing this on the top of my head. I've actually got one of those textbooks I was talking about, one of those contemporary ethical, but I don't want to cheat yet. I'm going to wait till I can't think of anything else, and then I'll open this up and see if I forgot something. There's immigration. What else was I about to say? I had something else on the tip of my tongue. Affirmative action. Who knows what is affirmative action? Is anyone familiar with that? Daniela?
Yeah, isn't affirmative action basically like where you have a pool of applicants of like people of color that you get to pick from, but they're all just as qualified as like any other, I guess, non-person of color applicant?
Right. The idea is that if you have and sometimes they do it by percentages, right? So some people argue that you should do it for percentages. That like a certain university, they should allow like 10% people should be black, and 10% should be Hispanic, and 10% should be white, and so there's a certain quota. And so, like you said, if you have 2 applicants to a job or to a university and they're completely equal, that you should give it to the person of color, right? Give it to the black person, the Latino, whatever, because they have been historically oppressed, they've been historically deprived of these opportunities. So as a sort of way of evening that disparity, you should give them extra choices or an extra bump because of that, right? And so that's the idea, and so you explained it pretty well. I think you're on the right track at least. Raven, you put education, and I'm not quite sure, but maybe, like, depending on what you mean by that. I think we'd be more specific. Gender fluidity, that was Nayeli. Yeah, I guess like gender identity. And I'm not really sure, again, it depends on how you approach that topic of gender identity, right? There's one way you can approach it where it's really, to me, at least I would argue, is more of a psychological or a sociological problem that sociologists would deal with, right? What is gender identity? How do we arrive at a sense of gender identity? Those, I guess you could argue, are philosophical questions, but they're not dealing with like whether it's right or wrong. And so, but that's, I guess, trans rights. Should transsexuals have the same rights? Should they be able to use the same bathroom? If you're a transsexual man, should you be able to use a transsexual woman? Someone who was once a man that transitioned to a woman. Should you be able to use a woman's restroom, right? And those sort of things. So I guess, yeah, that's definitely, those are some controversial topics that I think would be definitely considered contemporary ethical issues. Yeah, Moises says Environmentalism, sure, definitely. So environmental issues, right? You know, fossil fuels and global warming, and do we have an ethical responsibility to care about the planet, and those sort of things. Okay, great. We're getting a lot here. In fact, a few things that I wouldn't have thought of. You, Lisa, incest? She asked. I don't think that's a contemporary one. That's another yeah. And I don't know of any philosopher. I can't think of any ethicists who argues in favor of incest. It's pretty much universally, like, that's one of those weird things where, like, there's nobody's ever justified it that I can think of. I mean, the closest I guess you could say would be like I'm pretty sure Michel Foucault, he's a French thinker. He says something like, well, the only reason that incest is prohibited is because we have a natural aversion to it. And that might be more something, just a natural, you just don't feel that way. Of course, Freud would argue, if you're a Freudian, that no, you actually are that way. You're born incestuous towards your mom, and you have to overcome that or something. And it is a bad thing, but it is natural. But I'm looking at this list and I'm thinking, man, I think we pretty much got everything. But I want to make sure. I'm going to look at my little cheat sheet here. I'm going to look at my book and see if there's something else that jumps out. Abortion, we got that. Should sex involve commitment? So, if you have sex with somebody, should it be serious? That's an interesting one. This is a word that I see. I used to never see this word, but now it's becoming more common. Polyamory. No one used to know what this word meant. No one knew what it meant. Now everybody seems to know what it means. It's like hip now. I'm polyamorous, does anybody know what it is? It started to become a thing now, There's like groups about polyamory. Like you can go to some polyamorous meetup. No one knows what this means. Well, it just means basically having multiple partners, like poly means many, and amorous, love. It's having multiple lovers, I suppose, right? So, should sex involve commitment, or is it okay to have casual sex, right? Human cloning. I guess that's another. I'm surprised we didn't think about that one. Cloning. What else? We mentioned marriage laws, so same-sex marriage, we got that. I'm going to erase the word human here because they say cloning in general. Like, there's another chapter on, is cloning pets justified? Like, what if you have a favorite dog and you never want to lose your dog, and they figure out a way to clone your dog so that when your dog dies, you get like a new version of your dog? Is that ethical, right? Is that right? Kind of reminds me, I think there's like a Black Mirror episode where like the woman's boyfriend dies and she gets a clone of him or something.
Didn't Barbara Streisand clone her dog?
Who did?
Barbara
Streisand? I think I heard something like that, yeah. Let's see, cloning pets. Oh, human organs, right? Organ donating, right? Organ donors, right? Organ donations. Some think that if you donate organs, then maybe like doctors, if they're really desperate for your organs, might not try as hard to save you or something like this. This might still be some issue that comes up. Also, there's been a lot of controversy with some people, and again, if this video might, if I post it on YouTube, it might get flagged because I'll be critical of the Chinese government. But apparently the government of China has been accused of doing this, of actually harvesting people's organs, like dissidents and people who are critical of the government. They'll just disappear or die mysteriously. And, the Chinese government, this was a long time ago. I don't know. I haven't heard anything like it in a while. But I remember in the 90s and early 2000s, there were a lot of articles about how the Chinese government was being accused of harvesting organs and selling them on the sort of the black market. Yeah, we talked about, I already mentioned drugs, right? Should drugs be legalized? Affirmative action. Somebody mentioned, I think Raven, or maybe it was Nayeli, the gun debate, gun control. I think it was, yeah, I think it was Raven. Affirmative action we mentioned. The death penalty. Oh, torture. That's something that hasn't come up in the news quite at all much. They seem to stop talking about it when Obama became president. But I'm under the Bush administration. There was a lot of torture going on, and so the FBI, the CIA, they were involved in tortures and people getting tortured. So they would capture enemies and torture them for information. Is that ethical to torture them? Right? It's illegal under international law. And we already mentioned euthanasia, right? Doctor-assisted suicide and animal rights. Somebody wrote, let's see, low-wage working. I like this. So racial profiling. Yeah, you would think racial profiling is just obviously a bad thing, but there are a few people that argue it's actually okay in very limited situations. Like, it's okay if, like for instance, after 9/11, it's okay to racially profile people who look like they're Muslim at the airport, right? It's okay to, even though it's inconvenient for them and it is kind of racist, it's still like, I don't know, like they justify it in the fact that like the people that are terrorists, they tend to look like you. That doesn't mean you are one, but you're more likely to be one. So I'm going to go ahead and like profile you, right? And some would say that no, that's not fair, and it's actually, if anything, it might actually get in the way of finding the real people that are the perpetrators, because you're focusing on superficial things rather than behaviors and the way the person's acting or talking or things like this. There are other ways to be safe without racial profiling. Low wage working. I don't know how to put this, but maybe that what you're talking about, low wage working. Should we feel guilty about buying things like iPhones when we know that these phones are built by low wage workers, sometimes forced labor? There are people in forced labor camps that are forced to make these products. Is that ethical? So I'm just going to put labor issues, or maybe like labor, and I'll put / production issues, right? Is it ethical to buy products or to support companies who use slave labor, low wage labor, poverty wages, and things like this? Population control, right? That itself, I think, I don't think anybody talks about population control. At least they don't use that term. They'll talk about overpopulation and how we need to, I guess we need to spread education about birth control, and so that the population doesn't go out of control. But I don't know. I guess there's the sort of that to me that might just tie into environmental issues. So I'm not going to write population control. Environmental issues. Maybe there's too many of us, or we need to like have less big families if we're going to be able to tackle the carbon issue or something. Tattoos, I'm not really sure what the ethical issue is with tattoos. I know that, according to some religions or some understandings of some religions, they're bad. I'm so shocked at how many people call themselves Christians and they're covered in tattoos, and they don't realize like that's actually kind of a contradiction. Of course, like there's a lot of Christians I know who like read their horoscope and they follow astrology, and I'm like, guys, have you read the Bible? Like, have you read that book? You shall not mark your body with symbols, and you shall not consult the stars for signs, right? That's satanic, evil sorcery, right? But to me, that's more of a religious thing. I don't know what the ethical issue with tattoos would be, right? I mean, maybe I'm missing something, but I think it's, to me, like, I'm not really that into tattoos. I used to be, but then I moved to Austin and it just kind of got nauseous. I was just like so over tattoos that I like don't want one anymore. They're just so trendy and ubiquitous that it's like not even rebellious anymore. So, but I don't know, like, I don't know if like any ethical, like if you want to like put ink in your body, then put ink in your skin. I don't care, whatever. If it looks cool, whatever. If it makes you feel cool and hip and rebellious or whatever, makes you feel like you're edgy, like, your favorite hip hop star, whatever. I don't care. But I'm not really quite sure. Again, maybe I'm missing something. If you want to jump in and say something, go ahead. But I'm not really quite sure the ethical angle to tattoos. But privacy rights, I think for sure. So privacy rights. We've got now that this crazy event happened at the Capitol and all these people stormed the Capitol. You've got all these congressmen and women talking about Patriot Act 2.0, and we have to have more surveillance for domestic terrorists. And I got to say, I'm a bit wary of this. I saw what happened after 9/11 with the Patriot Act. They said that they were going to just watch us, they're just going to watch the terrorists, and they just needed extra. But the Patriot Act was used mainly to bust drug guys, not terrorists, not Muslim extreme Muslim terrorists. So I think definitely that's a good, the idea. Should we have privacy? Should Facebook be able to follow us and know all this stuff about us? That definitely I think is a contemporary. I like you, Lisa. You put surrogacy. That's an interesting one. What is surrogacy? You want to explain, or should I?
I guess like when another woman can be able to carry your baby.
Right. Yeah. So some might say that there's an issue with that, and you might think, well, what's the problem? So what? It's great. What a nice person. She's willing to have a baby for someone else. Like some couple that can't have a baby, she's willing to carry that baby to term for that other couple. But the issue that comes up is that, usually the woman that does that is financially desperate. She's doing it because she needs money. At least that's the argument. The argument is that you're using, this woman, like, she doesn't want to be pregnant. Who would want to be pregnant for 9 months? Like, she's doing it out of desperation because she needs the money. And so maybe that might be some sort of issue, right? I've got an interesting comment here. Let me read. If I say language or dialect and accent, does that go into racial profiling? Yeah, I guess so. Again, like if you're talking about like, I heard that accent. They sound like they're Russian. We're, Russia spy. I'm going to search them because they have a Russian accent. Yeah, that would be an example of racial profiling, or, nationalistic profiling. Oscar put gambling, and I'll put it up here, but I don't know if that's really a contemporary ethical issue in so much as just an ethical issue. I mean, gambling's been around since there's been money, probably, since there's been property, really, and it's always been, considered like questionable. Is it good? Is it bad? But I'll put it anyway because I guess we have gambling laws. So I guess you're right. Like, there's drugs have been around forever, but I guess drug laws are sort of a new thing. Same thing with gambling laws. So I'll go ahead and I'll put it up there as well. And as you put international obligations, I'm going to put that together with sort of hunger and poverty. Or maybe how about this, instability? We could add that to the list because I think that's maybe what you have in mind, right? Do we, wealthier nations, do we have an obligation to help other nations that are struggling, right? Do we have any business, for instance, being in Iraq? If Iraq is chaotic, do we need to be over there to help them, or should that be their problem? Do we need to be in Syria? Do we need to be in Venezuela? Or is that they're their own country? Even if they're having problems and it's violent and people are dying, look, they're sovereign. We've got to let them figure it out, right? That might be one approach. But another approach says, no, we've got to get involved because we're stronger, we have more weapons, we have to help those people who are living under these horrible conditions, and we have to provide order and stability to their country. So yeah, that might be, let's see, Moises put, policing, police brutality, I guess, I'll put that. For police brutality, how do we go about like figuring out what the right amount is? Obviously, cops have a dangerous job sometimes, and they're going to have to use force. But when is it like ridiculous? Obviously, I think something like the George Floyd, it's like the dude is standing on his neck for like, what was it, like 2 minutes or something, or more. I mean, that's obviously ridiculous, But like, are there situations? Is there a middle ground? Are there some situations where maybe force is needed and that sort of thing? Good, right? So police reform. I guess I'll put, instead of brutality, I'll make it more open-ended. Police reform, right? When how should we train our cops? Maybe they don't need to be doing certain things, right? Like domestic violence calls. I've heard a lot of arguments that cops shouldn't do domestic violence calls. You should get a social worker or something like that. Let's see. I like that one. LGBT couples in kids shows, right? Some people think that that's like they think that that's wrong, and others think that there's nothing wrong with it. And if you think there's something wrong with it, then you're homophobic, right? I saw some story on the news about how there was this program in public schools where they had these I was about to say transvestite, but that's not politically correct anymore. Transsexual, they call themselves drag queens. But these drag queens would go to like kindergarten classrooms and read stories and read little kids' books to the kids. And the parents thought that some of the parents didn't like it, but most of them, I think this was California, so they're pretty liberal. They thought it was great, It's so wonderful. I want my kids to see a drag queen, And some might say, well, look, I've got nothing against drag queens, but they're kindergartners. Do they really need to be learning about sexual fluidity at that age? Like, can't they just go play with their little video games and their building blocks, and when they start to hit puberty, then maybe we can start talking about sexuality. So, you've got both, no, we need to expose them to as many different people as possible so they're more open-minded. And then others say, well, no, this is going to confuse them, right? So there's these, there's two sort of, sides of that. So, yeah, I think, I don't know how to put that. Maybe, gender identity, I'm going to put next to that LGBTQ rights. That would be, I think, kind of to sum up all those issues. Let's see. Carissa's laughing. We aren't a wealthy country. Yeah, actually, we really are. It's just that most people that are here aren't wealthy. As a nation, our GDP is ridiculous. But the problem is, I think, what is that? There's a statistic that Bernie Sanders always he always repeats it. So I can't remember. I can't believe I can't remember it. But it's like, the top 20% of the country owns 80% of the wealth or something like that. So yeah, we actually are the wealthiest nation in the world, but that's partly because of our stock market, and it's partly because of the US dollar. The fact that the US dollar is the world's currency. It's 80% of trade is done in US dollars. So if it wasn't for that, we probably wouldn't be the wealthiest nation. I mean, it looks like we're not going to be pretty soon if China keeps doing what it's doing. But I think your comment, though, brings up to me a good point, and it kind of comes back to the issue of poverty, instability, and I think somebody said international, it was Eunelis who said international obligations. A lot of people here in America, I know this was a big controversy with the last stimulus bill, they get really angry when they hear about all this money that's being sent to other nations, like millions of dollars going to Pakistan to teach them about gender identity. And people get angry because they're like, well, look at our cities. Our cities are falling apart. Look at our infrastructure. It's falling apart. Look at cities like Detroit and even parts of Houston. You can see they need work. They need help, and people are starving here. Why are we over halfway across the world in countries that most Americans have never heard of, spending all this money when we can't even help our own people? But then I think the people that are in charge, you know, I don't know. I think that, you know, to me, I think they're just out of touch. I mean, I could be wrong, whether you're on the right or the left, but I think they're just out of touch. They see this big pie chart that says the stock market's going up and that their portfolio is increasing, and they think everything's fine. So, I mean, I don't want to dismiss your point. You know, he's like, we aren't a wealthy country. Well, we are a wealthy country. We just aren't very wealthy people. Like, if you, person by person, most people in this country don't make a whole lot of money.
I thought we were in like trillions of dollars in debt.
Yeah, but that's actually not a bad thing, right? The debt is actually, you know, this is something that people don't understand. Like, debt is something you want, because if you don't have debt, then then basically no one cares about you, right? The fact that we owe money to all these other countries makes them want us to succeed, right? The problem is, though, we're using this debt to what are we using it for? What we're using it for is we're using it to basically build weapons and missiles. Most of our budget, a lot of our budget goes to defense, and we go to all these other countries and just bomb them and try to control them and try to, you know, make them stable. Places like Syria, Pakistan, Afghanistan, all this. You know, it'd be one thing if we were running up all this debt and actually investing in infrastructure. That's what China is doing right now. China has a huge debt, but they're building cities. Like, they have cities over there that are literally empty. Like, they have skyscrapers, highways, and no one even lives there. They're using all this debt to build stuff that has actual value. So this is another thing. I think politicians use this to confuse you guys. They're like, we can't afford healthcare. We can't afford this because look at all the debt. Oh, your grandkids will have to pay for that. How dare you, you selfish, wanting to live off your grandkids. And they don't like explain to you that debt it's always going to be there. Like, having a debt is part of being a sovereign nation in a capitalist economy where you have just currency that is just made up. It's not backed up by anything except for the bank that issues it. And so it's not like a house where you've got a budget every month and you've got to pay this bill and that bill. It's a completely different beast. You know, we basically own the printing press. We can print as much money as we want. The problem is, the more money we print, the less it's worth. And so the more debt that we keep accumulating, the less that the dollar's worth, and the less you can spend. And that's why prices keep going up. That's why housing prices keep going up. Goods and services keep going up. It's not that they're more valuable. It's just that the dollar is less valuable. And so, now we're getting all into economics, right? But this might actually be another contemporary ethical issue. How should I put this? Debt burden, right? That's something that I don't know if we want to talk about it because it's very technical. I think you have to understand economics a little bit more and how, like, fiat monetary and fractional banking works, and it gets really technical. But politicians use this all the time. Whenever they don't like something that's going to cost money, they always use the debt as a threat. Oh, how are we going to pay this off? Well, usually you pay it off because money becomes so cheap that, I'm kind of hoping that, like, that's what's going to happen to my student loans. If I keep waiting and pushing them down the road, that by the time I'm able to afford paying them off, like, the 40 grand that I owe will be like 1 week's salary, I mean, that's what you have in places like Zimbabwe, where you have to have like a wheelbarrow full of money to buy a loaf of bread. Like, everyone that lives there is a millionaire, and that doesn't mean anything because $1 million is like nothing, right? But this is also something, I guess, when we're coming up with budgetary political policies on how we're going to spend money, how we're going to allocate resources, right? What do we need to concern ourselves with as far as, like, future burden, future generations? I guess that would be definitely a contemporary ethical debate. I would argue again that as long as you're using the money to build stuff that's useful for society and it's going to benefit everyone, it should be really no problem. The problem is they're borrowing all this money and they're using it to bail out corporations. They're giving money to airlines. They're giving money to people that don't even tell us. The Fed doesn't really tell us where a lot of this money goes, but they're buying corporate bonds and things like that and propping up companies that just aren't doing well in order to keep their stock price high. And to me, that doesn't really benefit anybody at all, except for maybe people that own stock in those corporations. and maybe people who work for those corporations might be able to keep their job a little bit longer. But I would say if you're going to go into debt and you're going to run up all this, these future expenses that you got to pay back, are you going to go, let's say you have a credit card with, a limit of like $5,000. You could go out with that $5,000 and put a down payment on like a sports car, right? And wow, you have this badass sports car. But then let's imagine that you're doing that and you're 2 months behind on your rent and you got kids at home and they're hungry and you can't feed them. Like, that's really irresponsible. So it's like, I wouldn't mind you going into debt $5,000 if you were spending on groceries, paying your rent back, paying your utilities. But it seems to me like we're going into debt in order to, I don't know what we're doing as a country. We're going into debt in order to keep the stock market up, and we're going into debt in order to keep the military all over the world bombing people that we never met. And I know, to me, maybe I'm being unfair. I think maybe my view of things is very biased, but I just don't see how that is good for our country. I'm assuming the people that are on the other side are going to say things like, well, we have to be over there because the terrorists, or we have to be over there to keep ourselves safe, or we have to have the military all over the world so we can always have dominance in trade and all these other things. And it seems to me like we could do all that without being in all these military bases. But what do I know, right? But I think that debt burden, that might, again, kind of tie into this issue of hunger, poverty, international instability. How much responsibility do we have for this as a nation? If we're American citizens, do we have an obligation to care about this stuff? Or should we just worry about our own affairs, our own domestic affairs? Wow, we got a lot more on here than I wanted, actually. So that's a good thing. I'm not complaining. I'm glad. There's a lot more here than I expected to get out of the class. But unfortunately, that means that we don't have much time, not much time left to talk about virtue ethics. But I did this first because I kind of wanted to lay out some issues so that when we go through these ethical theories, we can start thinking about how they apply, right? Like, how would an Aristotle approach the death penalty, for instance? How would Aristotle approach hunger, poverty, and all of this? What would he think about marriage laws and same-sex marriage? So that's why I sort of laid out all the problems at the get-go. But let's just very briefly, I don't know how deep I'm going to get into this. Let's at least get started on virtue ethics. We'll have to probably do most of this next meeting. So, for next week, go ahead and, finish up that short Aristotle reading if you haven't already. And on Monday, what I'm guessing is we will probably, we'll finish virtue ethics. We'll talk a little bit about religion and ethics and how those relate. And if we have time, we probably won't, but if we have time, we'll talk about natural law theory. So that's what's coming next meeting. But today, let's get started on Aristotle. Let's look at virtue ethics. So now the word for virtue is actually arete. That's the Greek word for virtue. And it's sometimes translated not as virtue, but as excellence, right? So sometimes you'll see virtue, sometimes you see the word excellence. And the word in general, in the ancient Greek language, in general, the word basically just means you serve your function well. Right? You perform what you were designed to, you do what you were designed to do very well. Okay? So everything for Aristotle has a purpose. Everything has a function, including you, including every person. We all have a purpose. We all have a function. And if we perform that function well, if we do it with virtue, if we do it with excellence, right? right? That's arete. So I suppose you could even say like I have a really good coffee maker that has arete, right? If the coffee maker makes a really good cup of coffee, then it has arete, it has virtue. Now, obviously, Aristotle, when he talks about virtue, when he talks about virtue, he's talking about human virtue, human excellence. And he's going to differ quite a bit from his predecessor, Plato. So, let's talk a little bit about Plato, just very briefly. There was a reading I gave you for Plato. It's pretty short. That it's together with that reading on Herodotus that I did last time. We covered last time. But Plato, you could argue that he is about as strict a moral objectivist as you can get. So for him, there are these moral absolutes, and they're absolutely objective. What is good is a universal thing, right? So maybe some of you have taken a class in philosophy before. I don't know if there's anybody in here who's ever taken like intro to philosophy. You might have covered Plato and the forms. And he talks about the forms briefly in that excerpt that I gave you. So you can do that reading if you like. It's not that long. He talks about the form of the good and how the good is not dependent on what I think it is. It's just good. It doesn't depend on public opinion. Doesn't depend on the times. It is just good. He says that there are things like goodness and beauty and justice. And they are these eternal, non-physical, abstract ideas. Right, the term form is actually, it's the Greek word eidos, which could also be translated as idea, not necessarily as form. So all things that exist in this world, all the physical things, like human beings and animals and all these, they all participate in this universal form. So apparently there's a perfect form of human, or a perfect form of dog, or a perfect form of pigeon, or whatever the heck. And all animals, all humans, or all, even like things like this bottle, they're imperfect copies of that perfect ideal form. So for Plato, there's this higher realm that's separate from the physical realm. It's this higher realm that's not physical. It's outside of time and space. And all the things that are located in that non-physical realm, that higher realm of forms, they never change. They're eternal. So what's good is just good. It's not good today and then bad tomorrow, like my milk, where like my milk is good and then it spoils, right? This is the perfect goodness, and it never changes. So for Plato, in order to understand what's ethical or what's correct in this world, you necessarily have to understand that higher realm. And this world is always imperfect. So no matter how good you are in this world, you're flawed in some sense. But you can only judge your goodness in reference to that higher realm. So for Plato, it is absolutely essential that you study metaphysics, that you study philosophy, that you understand the fundamental nature of the universe and how everything fits together. And only then can you fully understand what living a good life is all about, and how to live a good life, and how to be a good person and treat others well. Otherwise, you don't really have knowledge of that. All knowledge comes from this higher realm. Now, Aristotle, even though he's much, indebted to Plato, and much of his philosophy is influenced by Platonic ideas, he very much disagrees, I would say, on a lot of these points. For Aristotle, it's not absolutely necessary that you study metaphysics and understand abstract notions of goodness and beauty and justice in order to be virtuous. I mean, it's important to be just, it's important to be good, it's important to do all these things, but having a sort of intellectual understanding of it is not necessary for Aristotle. What's really necessary is for him practice, right? You have to practice, okay? So I guess this sort of brings up the age-old distinction or tension between theory versus practice, right? You could argue that Plato, his approach to ethics is much more theoretical. You have to have a theoretical understanding of the good, and once you understand the good, you'll do it. You'll just do it. Your practice will follow from your theory, right? The way you act, the way you comport yourself will always be an outflow of your theoretical understanding. So the first order of business for Plato is to have that theoretical understanding, to know the forms, to know what is beautiful, what is just, what is unjust, and then to, because of that understanding, embody it in your practice. But for Aristotle, becoming virtuous, gaining excellence and virtue, having these great character traits like bravery and such, they don't come about through simple contemplation, through intellectual understanding. In fact, that's not enough. You could understand everything there is to know about ethical truth and still fail to do it. You have to practice. You have to develop, what he calls a habit. And that word habit, it typically has negative connotations, but it doesn't have to. It's a good habit to brush your teeth every day. It's a good habit to make your bed first thing in the morning, right? So there are good habits and there are bad habits. And so for Aristotle, learning to be a good person, becoming a good person, it's like developing good habits. And so you need good upbringing, you need good role models, you need skills to develop, life skills, social skills, and also what's good for you might be very much dependent on your situation. This is another distinction between Plato and Aristotle, that what is good for me might not be good for you. We all have different aims and different purposes. We have a different function because we're all unique. So what makes me excellent, what makes me the best version of myself I can be, what makes me virtuous might be quite different from what makes you virtuous. We might have different functions. Maybe my virtue is to be a good teacher or whatever, and your virtue is to be a doctor or a lawyer or a businessman who opens a business that benefits the community or whatever. So we all have a purpose in society, and fulfilling that purpose is our virtue. Becoming the best version of ourselves that we can be, and we achieve happiness. And we'll talk more about what Aristotle means by happiness next time. We're getting pretty close to the end of class. But I'll end really quick with this analogy. For Aristotle, becoming good, and in fact, he actually does this, so I'm kind of ripping him off, but he'll use the analogy of learning how to play an instrument. He uses flute playing, but nobody wants to play the flute anymore. Maybe a few of you. I like the flute, but I don't know if I'd ever want to learn it. I'd probably pick up something different if I was learning a new instrument. But let's say you want to play guitar. You want to be a guitarist. That's what everybody wants to be, a guitarist, right? You want to rock out like Jimi Hendrix. Well, if you went by Plato's advice, you might think that all you need to do is go pick up a bunch of books about playing guitar. But that's not going to work, right? You can't just sit down and read a book about how to play the guitar. Even if you understand it, you might read that book 5 million times until you've memorized every word, and it's a good book, and it has all the details, everything you need to know: how to hold your fingers, how to make a chord, how to play rhythm, how to play lead, how to improvise, and you read the whole darn book. But you never bought a guitar, you never plugged it into the amp, you never practice it. Even if you memorized everything there is to know about guitar playing, are you now a guitar player? I would say no, of course not. There's a funny movie. I don't know if it's that funny. I watched it when I was a kid, and it's for kids, really. It's like PG. but it cracked me up when I was 9. There's a movie called Short Circuit. Speaking of artificial intelligence, this movie's about this robot, Johnny Five, and he escapes from this government, military base, and he starts to develop his own consciousness. He's this robot, and there's a scene in the movie where he goes into a bookstore and he like reads all the books like super fast. He just, and immediately as soon as he reads the book, he knows how to be a brain surgeon, program computers, speak a million different languages. And so like all he needs is the relevant info, and then he's able to do it. And I think Aristotle would watch that movie and laugh and say, ha ha ha, maybe a computer could do that, but that's not how humans learn. Humans learn through practice, through sucking for a while. They might not be good. They pick up that guitar and they sound like crap, and they can't even play one chord because they didn't realize how much pressure on their fingers, and they needed to develop more strength in their fingers and all this. And so, but slowly and surely through practice, they're able to develop this skill. And once they have it and once it's down, they become excellent. They're able to maintain that excellence as long as they maintain the practice. Well, anyways, I'm rambling on and it's already time to go. It's like 15 after, so I'll stop there. I'm going to go ahead and stop recording. That's the end of the video, but I'll